So we went through the welcome and just a little bit about the agenda. We'll be talking about first understanding ableism, which I know can be a big topic. So I'm going to try to make sure I keep myself on time so that we can have a break at 4:15-ish. Then I'll talk about ableism and advocacy, disability justice principles, and then I'll share some resources and say goodbye from there. Okay. Let's go, little froggy. Oh yeah, we already did this. Amazing. Okay, so ableism is a big one. Uh, I am dividing ableism into different levels. First, from what is most visible in public to what is most private or individual. So you can see this iceberg here to represent that, and where we will start with structural ableism. So structural ableism, it shows up in our culture. It affects the ways that we redistribute resources. It influences public policy. Some examples of this can include the lack of public transportation, or the lack of accommodating public transportation, underfunded disability services, or laws that fail to protect against discrimination. The next one would be institutional ableism. And this is embedded in the ways that our organizations operate and the ways that they have administrative norms, including institutions and professions. So, for example, this might be rigid hiring practices. Like maybe they are not aware about how they're hiring people with a bias against disability, how they might have very inflexible scheduling in their work practices. Another example is schools that penalize alternative formats for assignments. And for example, if a student were to request that, they might be seen as getting an easy pass or something. So having those types of mentalities is what we would call institutional ableism because they're across the whole organization in the way that they operate. The next one, moving towards the individual experience, is interpersonal, which is our daily interactions with our peers, strangers, just people we meet, including microaggressions, assumptions of incompetence. So, if you're not sure what that means, it just means like when you see somebody maybe with a visible disability, you might not realize that you're treating them with like infantilization, or you're not really recognizing that maybe they can do something. Yeah, and another example is using patronizing language. So, for example, if a doctor says you don't look disabled, that is not good. But it is an example of interpersonal ableism and the kind of ableism that someone might experience in their day-to-day life. Um, and the last one would be internalized ableism. This is something that I think I will be talking a little bit more about, which really entails internalized shame, self-doubt about your personal capabilities, or experience, or having personal beliefs that conform to normative standards. For example, if you punish yourself beyond reasonable capacity, oh, sorry, let me start again. If you punish yourself because you feel that you're not meeting social norms and expectations, despite the fact that you are spending your energy and effort and spirit beyond reasonable capacity, that is unfortunately a big internalized ableism. I know in the autistic community, people we tend to interpret things literally. And when we interpret a phrase like giving your 100%, we might take that literally and push ourselves beyond reasonable capacity without realizing that what we are doing is internalized ableism, which is the expectation that everyone is the same and should be able to attain the same standard of performance, which is very unfair and shameful and not nice. But it is important that we are aware of it. So, in summary, ableism can be considered the exploitation, extraction, and rejection of our bodily autonomy and agency of ourselves. And why is that? I talked about ableism in different contexts, right? So if we go back, we talk about ableism through institutions, our culture, the ways that we interact with each other. And yes, the slides will be available after the presentation. It will be in the email that's sent out after the session. So why do I have this definition that defines ableism as the exploitation of our bodily autonomy? Um, because if we think about the ways that ableism presents itself, it is the denial of our basic needs, or not just our basic needs, but the reality of our needs and the agency that we have of ourselves in order to advocate and meet our own needs, right? Because ableism is a lot of you should be able to, or why can't you, right? And it suppresses our ability and permission to say, no, this is what is hurting me right now, and this is what I am able to do, or this is what I am not able to do. So that is why I am defining the term of ableism as the exploitation of our bodily autonomy, basically. So, to continue this question of how ableism appears across systems of oppression, um, I also want to talk about like why is ableism something that doesn't seem to get as much attention as maybe, let's say, racism or patriarchy. Why is it so invisible, even within quote unquote leftist spaces, right? And why is it so threatening for sometimes when we do bring it up? So to demonstrate how invisible it is, when we think of the different systems of oppression, and when I say systems of oppression, these are ideas or beliefs that were designed to discriminate or put a specific group of people at a disadvantage for the benefit of somebody else. So racism, patriarchy, colonialism, classism, and heteronormativity. All of these things are different systems of oppression, right? And if we quickly go through like who racism targets racialized people, of course. Um, Patriarchy targets women and gender diverse people. Colonialism targets indigenous communities. Classism targets poverty. Heteronormativity targets queer love, right? And in all of these systems of oppression, all of them are dictating what the targeted group of people is allowed to access or is not allowed to access, including their own bodies, right? Because if we go through each one, let's say racism, for example, slavery is part of racism, and that's literally ownership of the body. Patriarchy, for example, it controls access to abortion or gender affirming care. Those are also examples of how it controls our bodies and what we're allowed to do with our bodies. Colonialism, it controls indigenous sovereignty and their right to mobility and moving around freely. It controls their access to resources, to their own homes, and it controls their ability be to have self-determination of their futures and what is good for their communities and their children. Um, Classism, it is all about keeping people poor, working people poor, right? So, for example, wage theft, violating labor rights, having a structure that forces people to be at a certain time and place every single day just so that they can make ends meet. That is another form of not allowing people to have agency and control over where they can physically be. And lastly, heteronormativity is controlling our relationship structures, which violates our right to build our own systems of support, to have the opportunity to choose who we can call family or who we can have in our home unit. So all of these things are daily messages that we receive of what we are not allowed to do with our physical bodies. And at the very bottom, all of these things can only be put into practice with this fundamental ableist belief that is the exploitation, extraction, and denial of our body autonomy. So that is why ableism is so invisible, because it's the underlying fundamental belief that most of us have, and it's existed prior to capitalism. It's existed in some of the oldest systems of oppression, like patriarchy, right, or classism. These are systems of oppression that span hundreds and hundreds of years. And all of that can only exist if with this fundamental belief that we don't have the rights to advocate for our body. We don't have the right to control where our bodies are, or where we're allowed to be. And it takes away our fundamental agency about how we want to feel and what we are allowed to feel. So it's no wonder that ableism is so invisible, because we're so used to having this as the default in the ways that we interact with each other, in the ways that we view our own selves. And we also participate, and not to don't blame yourself, please, about oh no, I need to like be better. Like, please don't do that. Please be nice to yourself. But we do also participate in being ableist towards ourselves, and that's the whole idea of ableism. Sorry, internalized ableism is that um, we also participate in expecting ourselves to conform to whatever standard cultural expectations and standards that we have for ourselves. Like, I should be exactly on time every single day I arrive to work, and um, everybody else can do it, so why can't I do it? And pushing ourselves beyond our reasonable capacity because we are so used to living in systems that enslave or exploit our bodies, right? So, of course, we would internalize these things and inadvertently also treat ourselves and our bodies as a commodity and resource that needs to just listen and bend towards our will, right? But part of understanding ableism as a common root is undoing that conditioning and that cultural expectation, right? Um, okay. So I hope that clarifies why ableism is so invisible and so pervasive. Um, oops. Yeah. And ultimately, it boils down to its universality. And the fact that it's so invisible and so universal affects how we work and affects how we show up in organizing for climate justice, right? And it's important to be aware of those things so that we can recognize them in each other and not shame ourselves or shame each other for doing that, but for recognizing that this is the reality that the human race has lived in, And of course, we would bring this into organizing because that's the reality of what we are trying to change, right? Um, and it affects how sustainable we can be. And if we are aware of it, then we don't need to carry it into the futures that we are trying to build. And we can continue moving forward, and shedding what doesn't serve us anymore, right? Okay, it's a little bit early, so maybe I'll do the break later. Okay, sorry. I hope that's okay with everyone. Um, but I hope that's a good introduction to, oh my gosh, thank you so much for the hearts. It's so lovely. It's so cute. I hope that was a good introduction to getting us on the same page of understanding ableism. I think it's really easy to just be like, oh yeah, it's when there's no elevator, like the TTC doesn't do a good job. Like, yes, of course, that is ableism. But I think sometimes it's important to understand ableism as it relates to our relationship with each other, our relationships with the resources that we have, and the relationship that we have with ourselves. Because it's easy not to see it when it's so ingrained in our day-to-day life with how we survive work and how we survive capitalism. Because sometimes we do have to push ourselves, for the sake of survival, but it's important to be aware of how that affects us, right? Um, so what does our work culture demand from us? And this is another time where like I won't really be looking at the Miro, but if you have thoughts, I think it'd be really great if you want to share them on the Miro. Um, yeah. So how does ableism show up in our work? Let's evaluate work and capitalism first, because we spend most of our time in the day trying to survive work. Um, and we've learned to adapt in ways that allows us to survive. So I don't want to use like good or bad language because I want to embrace the fact that we do really hard things to survive difficult circumstances. Um, and I really want people to feel like they can be compassionate towards themselves when they realize that some of the ways that we survive doesn't work or serve us when we go into our organizing communities, right? Um, it's like we are surviving capitalism 9 to 5 every day or whatever. And then at night, when we go into organizing, how can we leave those survival tactics at the door? Because they're still important, because we still live in this reality, right? How can we leave that at the door so that when we do come together, we can be sustainable and we can continue our work, without ableist expectations? Um, okay. So there's going to be a bunch of words that pop up as I tap through my PowerPoint. Um, and I just wanted to be quiet for a second to give you guys the opportunity to just read what shows up on the screen. Oops. Okay. So I hope you guys could take that in. And if you have thoughts, feel free to write on the Miro and share them. Um, but these are all things that we do in our day-to-day or have learned to do in order to survive capitalism, right? These are also things that are incentivized and encouraged and have a lot of like moral weight to them, even. Sometimes people think that, oh, if I just like hustle more, then people will think that I'm committed, or people will think that I'm a good team player, right? And that could be true. And there are benefits to that. So sometimes we do have to like pretend, or yeah, pretend, or not so much when we don't realize we're doing that, then it's not really pretending. But it can go into overdrive and we can like hurt ourselves, right? Or we are used to avoiding liability or minimizing liability for the sake of profit, right? And it's easy for us to start feeling like having too many diverse voices is going to slow down the machine for generating profit. So it's better if we just keep decisions behind a closed door. These are the little things that we absorb and are encouraged to do that sometimes we're not aware of. Or if we are aware of it, we don't realize how it takes a toll on us, right? Because it's really tiring to always feel like you're under the gun, right? And some of these things might become muscle, like knee-jerk reactions that we don't realize we're carrying with us into our organizing. So I wanted to focus on a few of the things that popped up in that previous slide and talk about their role and why they are the ways that we adapt to surviving capitalism, and then recontextualize and see how these same things can show up in our organizing and inhibit our ability to meaningfully connect with each other, to organize sustainably, which means not just like being conscious of like where our resources come from for the environment, but also that things that affect the longevity and the effectiveness or ability to gather and connect. Yeah, I will be talking through both lenses. Okay, so it's 4:10. I think this is a good time to take a break. And when we come back, we will talk about more cool stuff. Okay, see you in 5 minutes, 4:15. Let's come back at 4:15. Okay, it is 4:15. Hope folks are trickling back in and feeling good about continuing the session. Amazing. Okay, so we left off talking about ableism and how it shows up in work and the ways that we adapt to surviving capitalism. Okay, and the first thing I wanted to talk about was hustle culture. You know what? For some of us who like to know everything, like me, hustle culture and then rigid authority and then perfectionism. Okay, so now you know what's coming up. Okay, so rigid authority. Under capitalism, we are used to following a chain of command, right? We define authority by whoever the institutions deem to be authority, right? Usually that's defined by whoever has the most private wealth, regardless of how or when that was acquired. Um, so it's not always like rightful, but it's something that we are conditioned to respect, right? And traditional capitalist rigid authority demands submission. It doesn't allow us to feel whether or not we actually respect somebody. And we are used to um, being expected to fully submit ourselves to gain the approval of whoever is deemed the person we should respect or be in authority. Um, and rigid authority also assumes that there are very strict roles in who has the knowledge and who doesn't, or who has the experience and who doesn't. Um, and for example, there is the professor and there is the student in academia, right? Um, and it's this assumption that the professor is all knowing and their judgment cannot be questioned because they are the expert, despite the fact that the last time they were in school was maybe like 40 years ago, and they are still holding on expectations to students in a context and environment that is very different from one that they are accustomed to, right? Um, and you end up with people in authority who refuse to be held accountable and refuse to learn from students who grew up navigating different contexts and also like vice versa, right? You have um, students with expecting that their professor should know everything, right? And this rigid definition of who is allowed to have the right to talk about what they know or what they think they know, um, it doesn't allow for a fair collaborative opportunity to learn from each other. And it denies people's honest truth. It doesn't let you build trust in order to respect someone because you genuinely feel that they have the lived experience or the knowledge that you respect, right? Um, let's see. Sorry, one sec. Da, da, da. Okay. And when we think about rigid authority and how it shows up in our organizing, we often might assume that we need to, in order to be quote unquote effective, we have to operate within a nonprofit or some sort of like formal organization in order to deem ourselves um, an quote unquote advocate or a respectable leader in social justice, that we have to gain the approval of some formal institution in order to feel like we are good enough to stand up for a cause. This is one way that rigid authority shows up in the way that we organize and the way that we might have these knee-jerk reactions to feel valid, right? But being part of building a new way of um, building community and moving towards sustainability shouldn't require the approval of the people who are working against those goals, right? That doesn't make any sense. And part of disability justice is to make things accessible and to believe and respect people because we genuinely understand who they are and because they've earned our trust or we earn the trust of each other to have more honest ways of redefining what we call as authority, right? Because authority inherently isn't a bad thing, but it's a bad thing if authority automatically demands full submission. And that is compromising our agency and autonomy to determine what we really feel is good for us. Um, Yeah, so that's some of the ways that we might still operate within rigid authority and very rigid roles. Um, Basically, to sum it up, we should be able to trust our feelings and act upon them. Um, in the next slide, the next thing I want to talk about is perfectionism because capitalism often demands perfectionism. We are used to presenting ourselves as products and selling our labor, which requires us to be impossibly consistent in the level of performance and the ways that we show up every time. And this is especially violent if we are what we identify with multiple marginalizations, right? Like if you're a racialized person, you might feel pressure to always be a high achiever, so that you can prove yourself more to your like white colleagues, right? Um, and perfectionism also assumes that we have control over everything. Um, for example, like if you're working on a project and um, somebody fell through with like being a vendor or being able to cater your event, right? Um, it's then your boss might be like, "Oh, you could have foreseen this. This is something where your preparedness is questioned, right? Like, um, but there are things that we can't control, and they shouldn't be a personal failure or be seen as such. Perfectionism also is the expectation of other people around us to maintain exactly the same performance that they maybe showed up in one time or expecting that everybody has the same capabilities, right? And perfectionism is highly again restrictive, similar to rigid authority. Um, and it doesn't let us to acknowledge our realities and acknowledge how things change, right? And it also, because it affects our reputation, right? We might be more prone to have quick fixes or short-sighted goals where we have a PR incident and now we have to make ourselves look good. So we might be prone to virtue signaling. And if you're not aware of what that is, it means saying a few nice sounding things to seem like you are a virtuous or moral person. And when we are so obsessed with the way that we think we are perceived, we might play into respectability politics, which is, if you're not aware, if respectability politics is the idea that if we are able to look a certain way or behave a certain way, then we can achieve whatever we need to achieve. And it plays into what we think we should be able to do, or what we think we should be able to show up as, right? And why is perfectionism so intense? Like, um, why is this something that is incentivized so much under capitalism? Right. And one, as I mentioned, is because we view ourselves and our bodies and our energy as a product, right? As our labor, we need to prove when we sell our labor, we have to prove that we are worth paying for. And another reason is that because we learn within capitalism that if we want to be respected, we need to acquire authority, right? This is where we enter into that pitfall of competing within respectability politics, virtue signaling, without really understanding the words that we're saying and co-opting language that we don't understand the context of. And within capitalist perfectionism, we don't earn trust. There's no trust or relationship building. But because we are used to recognizing authority and being and understanding that, oh, if we ever want somebody to listen to us, we have to demand it, right? So these are some of the things that we don't realize that we internalize about how we can get people to listen to our ideas, right? When we don't realize that this is how we view authority. Um, and this can show up in organizing through lateral violence and emotional perfectionism. Because when we learn that in order to be heard, um, we have to like scream into the void. Or if we don't scream into the void, we have to acquire authority in order to demand getting heard. We learned that the importance of gaining social power to justify us like wanting an audience from people. And what happens is that we learn to abandon the real parts of ourselves that doesn't meet the ideal straight, non-disabled white man, right? Because that is ultimately the quote unquote ideal that we are taught to strive to become or get closer to, right? Um, and we don't realize how when we hold these perceptions of authority and we hold this understanding that we can only be listened to if we demand it through acquiring social power and acquiring authority, we perpetuate that violence onto other people who share our marginalized identities and end up hurting each other, right? And this is something that fragments. This is an intentional strategy of like divide and conquer, right? Um, People start tokenizing themselves or tokenizing other people because instead of recognizing the reality of living within your body, for example, as a disabled person, or living within your body as a racialized person, and you only use it to hopefully attain more respectability, that's just another way of exploiting yourself and your body because you're not realizing the reality of your lived experience, right? And you further, it's easy to fall into a trap of further burrowing yourself into this very narrow, individual self-perception just for the sake of conformity and approval and to feel heard, right? Um, but we don't have to do that because we can leave that at the door when we are coming together to organize and to build systems of working and collaboration that doesn't require us to abandon ourselves, right? And when we shift our understanding of authority to be based off of how we really feel about each other and about like how much we respect or trust each other, then we can build honest systems of um, who we choose to be called leaders in our community, right? And we can be more honest with each other, right? In building that, fostering that connection and relationship and trust building. Um, Earlier, I mentioned another example of how perfectionism shows up in organizing is emotional perfectionism, because we're so accustomed to being predictable in our labor and to being predictable in our social hierarchy so that we don't threaten whoever is above us, right? Um, we might become conflict avoidant, and this is really common um, in organizing spaces. We might miss the opportunity to understand each other, or we might even start to feel like conflict is um, an annoying or frustrating thing that is not allowing us to reach our goals as a collective or as a um, organizing community, right? But they are essential because they help us to understand each other and build trust and inclusivity. Because what is the point of organizing without our relationships within community, right? If we are always saying that, yeah, we're trying to represent community voices, but we don't allow for people to bring the things that hurt them in this space, then that's when we stop really advocating for community because we're not even listening or holding the space to even understand each other, right? Um, that's another way of how perfectionism shows up, which is emotional perfectionism. Um, okay, so now I'm going to talk about more about disability justice principles, where they come from, and what it means to stand for disability justice. There's a really important organization called Sins Invalid, and they have these 10 principles that are the holy 10 laws of disability justice principles. So, for example, intersectionality, which is acknowledging the different marginalized identities that people have and the ways that they show up, and acknowledging that oppression has a cumulative effect, right? The more number of intersections people have, the further away they are from the assumption that everyone is a straight white man. Um, and the more vulnerable they are to different systems of oppression. And the next one is having leadership of the most impacted. And this is something that is very antithetical to capitalism because we are used to finding whoever fits our idea of the ideal leader, right? And putting them on a pedestal. Whereas here in disability justice, we are recognizing the lived experience of the people who have gone through the system and have been impacted by the systems the most because they have the map and the wisdom and the guidance to lead us through it and to really teach us about what they know about our shared oppressive systems. The next is the anti-capitalist politic. So refusing to treat each other or any forms of life and resources as a means of generating profit. Commitment to cross-movement organizing. And this is something that even people in the disability community feel that the greater transformative justice movements even forget about disability as cross disability, like cross solidarity. And so this is a really big one, but also from within disability to have cross solidarity with other issues is a major part of disability justice. Interdependence and recognizing how people, we need to rely on each other and build infrastructure to meet each other's needs, for example, through mutual aid, and the importance of interdependence in order to shift the surveillance and opportunity for the state to control the ways that we live and survive, and building our own ways of supporting each other based on meeting each other's needs. And the next one is collective access. And this means ensuring that everyone who is in the disability space or beyond has the right to access meaningfully and participate meaningfully, and to acknowledge different types of barriers that people have and to participate in community spaces. And the last one is collective liberation, which is um, acknowledging how intertwined our liberation is within our local community and the global community, and advocating for each other in that way. Okay. So we are coming up to the end almost, and this is where you can also feel free to like jump in the chat if you know any other organizations that you want to highlight. But this is my list of Toronto climate justice organizations. I'll start with the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network. So they are a Toronto-based activist group that organizes to draw attention and resist the negligent practices of Canadian mining companies. And if you didn't know, Canadian mining companies comprise over 75% of mining businesses worldwide. Um, each of these, oh, T, oh, maybe that was, sorry, I was just reading the comments. Um, the Turtle Protectors High Park is another really great group. They are Indigenous founded and led organization that is dedicated to protecting the turtles in Hyde Park, but also in a number of different parks around the city, because 90% of turtle eggs are either trampled by park visitors, eaten by predators, or eaten by off-leash dogs roaming in the area. So they do really great work trying to protect the nests of the turtles' nests and making sure that they survive. Um, the next one is Climate Justice Toronto, which is a group that fights for transformative class-based climate action in Toronto and beyond. They also have a podcast, and they operate through intersectional lenses, and recently they advocated for tenant rights with the recent Bill 60. Yeah. Um, Fridays for Future Toronto, they are a global climate strike movement, but Toronto also has a chapter, and they're a youth-led grassroots organization that approaches climate justice through an intersectional social justice lens. Um, and Sisters in Solidarity is another local group, which is a group of Indigenous matriarchs, elders, and allies that set up peaceful assembly and ceremonial camp at Inukshuk Park, which is right by Ontario Place. Um, and they were initially, well, are continuing to resist Bill 5 and Bill C5, and other acts that undermine treaties with the Imperial Crown, Anishinaabe law, and the clan system. They also have a GoFundMe um, to help keep the camp going and amplify their voices against ecological disasters and systemic injustices. I had the privilege of visiting a few times, and they're a very group of lovely people, mostly women and matriarchs and elders. So if you're in the area and you're able to help out with providing some foods and stuff, they frequently request for those types of things. And yeah, they're super nice. The last two that I wanted to mention is maybe a slight departure from direct climate action groups, but Anak Bayan, which I may be mispronouncing, um, they are a Filipino youth group in Toronto that advocates for Philippine issues and issues affecting the Filipino community and diaspora in Canada. And the reason why I brought them up is because recently uh, in November, there were two back-to-back floods that really displaced a lot of people and really affected farmers and is now threatening people's access to food, and prices have skyrocketed a lot. And they are calling for donations and support because not only did a lot of people die from the climate disaster, but also a lot of people are now displaced. And there's also been a lot of recent rallying in the Philippines and suppression because people are calling out the government for being corrupt and not doing their due diligence to prevent um, climate disasters from affecting people to such a large scale. So I really wanted to promote them today, also because they're having a concert coming up, I believe on the 19th, which is fundraising for the Philippines and people affected by the floods. So I would really encourage people to learn more about that because I feel like it's not getting reported enough. And for me, I'm Chinese and my parents are from Hong Kong, and I I am trying to learn more about the Filipino community and news because I'm recognizing how Southeast Asian issues get missed in or intentionally underreported a lot. Um, so yeah, I hope people can check that out. Um, and the very last group, that the BIPOC is the BIPOC Death and Grief Talks. I personally joined their session. They are so cool. They're so cool. So they're a collective care group that supports BIPOC folks through grief and loss. They do really excellent work talking about grief across a number of issues, including activism, social work, family issues, or relationships, body dysmorphia, and a lot of things, right? So when we hear about grief, often we think about like, oh, somebody has passed away, right? But grief can show up in so many different forms, and it's a very like it's an emotion that isn't just tied to death, right? It can be, but it shows up a lot in our activism, like grief when we see more and more things happening, and the grief that comes up sometimes in organizing because organizing is a really difficult thing to do, and we take on a lot of each other's like emotional like I don't want to say baggage, but anyways, we exercise a lot of empathy for each other, which is a very heavy thing to do and can bring up a lot of grief. So BIPOC Death and Grief Talks is a really great space for it's BIPOC only. So please respect that. And yes, they do really amazing work. And they're also Black led, I believe. Yeah. So that is pretty much it. For me, very last thing, two things I need to mention. I will send the slides in the email after the session. And I also created this slide and the previous slide for people to reflect upon reflect upon how they maybe have internalized ableism, the things that they people want to leave behind and want to carry forward into our collective sustainable future. And hopefully, it'll also help shine some light on the ways that you adapt and survive capitalism and address that in a self-compassionate way and with empathy so that we can shed those things when we build our new collective future. Um, and I am building a network for marginalized, independent, self-employed creators or businesses. So if you are racialized and you have an additional marginalization, I would love to promote you on my page so that we can build a new economy and promote each other and support each other and find connection and resilience in each other. So if you want to work with me, I can feature you for free. There's no cost. Yeah. So that's it for me today. Though we're meeting, closing off a little bit early, but hopefully that can give you back some time. And thank you so much for joining. I was really excited for this, and I feel like I hope people were able to learn something today. And thank you so much for sharing your Sunday with me. Okay.